To the world, she was the nation's grandmother, the small, smiling woman in pastel who had stayed in London through the worst of the bombing and waved from the balcony for half a century. But inside the private bank that served the royal family, a different record was kept. And by the end of the 1990s, it showed her £4 million into the red. She never counted a cost, and she never forgave an injury. The governess who raised her daughters would die alone, cut off for nearly 40 years for the sin of one gentle book. The most loved woman in Britain kept a ledger no camera ever saw. What did the charm actually cost, and who was made to pay for it? If you like the stories that sit behind the official portrait, the ones the family photograph was arranged to cover, subscribe and stay with this one to the end. What it becomes is not what it looks like at the start. Chapter 1. The girl who was never royal. She was born the 9th of 10 children of a Scottish earl, in a family rich in land and old titles, but a very long way from any throne. The date was the 4th of August, 1900, the last summer of the old Queen's reign, and the child was christened Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes Lyon. Her father was Claude Bowes Lyon, then Lord Glamis, and later the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her mother was Cecilia. The family seat was Glamis Castle in Angus, a grey pile of towers and turrets on the edge of the Highlands, heavy with age and legend. And the English house was St Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire, gentler and warmer, hidden in beech woods. Between the two houses, the youngest Bowes Lyon children ran more or less free, and the youngest daughter of them all grew up loved, indulged, and entirely secure in a world that seemed as though it would last forever. This world needs describing precisely for what it was and for what it was not. It was aristocracy of the oldest and most settled kind. There were servants at every turn, gardeners and grooms and nursery maids, shooting parties in the autumn, long ordered days that turned on meals and prayers and the seasons of the land. There was a lineage that ran back through Scottish history for centuries, a castle thick with ghost stories and royal history, a name that opened any door in the country. The Bowes Lyons belonged to the small closed caste that owned much of Britain, intermarried among itself, and governed the rhythm of the countryside as it had for generations. What they did not have, and this matters for everything that came after, was a crown. They were earls, not princes. By the standards of the very grandest dukes, the men who counted their acres in the hundreds of thousands, they were not even enormously rich. Elizabeth grew up close to the top of the British class system, but not at its summit, and nowhere near the royal family into which she would one day marry. That vanished world deserves a moment, because she was among the last people alive to be shaped wholly by it. The Britain of 1900 was still governed, in its bones, by a few thousand landed families who owned the greater part of the country between them and passed it down, house and acre and title, from one generation to the next. A great estate like Glamis was not merely a home, it was a small kingdom, employing scores of people, drawing its income from the rents of tenant farms, ordered by an ancient hierarchy that ran from the earl at the top down through the factor and the butler and the headkeeper to the youngest boot boy. The family at the summit of it did not work in any sense a modern person would recognize. It presided, it was waited upon, and the whole vast apparatus beneath it existed to make that presiding look effortless, natural, and free. That was the England and the Scotland that made Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, and much of it would be swept away within her own lifetime by war and taxation and the slow ruin of the great estates. She carried its assumptions, unaltered, into a century that had stopped believing in them. That is the first and quietest of the many contradictions in her, that a woman who would come to seem the very embodiment of the modern monarchy, warm and public and beloved, was formed entirely by a vanishing old world of rank and land and hidden money, and never truly left it behind. That gap between the comfortable and the supreme shaped her more than any single event of her childhood. She was raised to a particular idea of how a great family lived, and at the center of that idea was a silence about money so complete that it amounted to a philosophy. In a house like Glamis, money was something that surrounded you and was never discussed. Cost was a matter for servants and agents and men of business, dealt with out of sight, so that the life above stairs could run without a visible seam. A girl in that house did not see a bill. She saw flowers arrive and fires laid, and horses saddled and dinners served, and the machinery that paid for it all stayed hidden, as good machinery was supposed to. The whole aristocratic economy of the age worked this way. Land produced rents, rents were gathered by agents, agents paid the tradesmen, and the family at the top simply lived, insulated by layers of other people from any direct contact with the price of things. The lesson sank deep, and it never left her. Decades later, when she was the most expensive woman in Britain to maintain, the people who kept her accounts would describe someone with the haziest notion of what anything actually cost, and they would say it as though it were a puzzle. It was not a puzzle at all. It was the direct product of a childhood in which the cost of living had been made invisible by design, a lesson so thoroughly learned that she carried it, unaltered, from a nursery at Glamis into a palace, and from a palace into a widowhood that ran millions of pounds into debt without her ever quite noticing. She was, by every account, a charming child, and the charm was noticed early. She had a gift for making the person in front of her feel chosen, warmed, singled out, and it was a gift that worked on adults and children, on servants and grandees alike. In a large family of 10, she learned to hold a room without raising her voice, to win an argument by never seeming to have one, to disarm with a look and a smile before any disagreement could form. This too became a working part of her, though no one watching a small girl at Glamis could have guessed what it would one day be asked to do. The First World War broke over that ordered world when she was 14 years old, and it gave the charm its first serious employment. Glamis was turned over to the war effort as a convalescent home for wounded soldiers, and the young Elizabeth helped to nurse and entertain the men who came back broken from the trenches of France and Flanders. It was, in its way, her first public role, and it taught her the thing she would build a life upon. Wounded, frightened, homesick men responded to warmth. A kind word, a shared cigarette, a small joke, the sense of being noticed by a pretty girl from the big house did more for a soldier's spirits than any grand official gesture. She learned, without any tutor setting out to teach it, that charm was not merely pleasant. Charm was useful. Charm did work that money, and rank alone could not do, and it did that work on everyone, without exception, who came within its range. By the time the war ended, she was a young woman moving through the narrowing world of the post-war aristocracy, a world thinned by the dead and shadowed by the sense that something had ended and would not return. The great houses were still standing, the shooting parties still gathered, the debutantes still came out into society, but the easy confidence of the Edwardian summer was gone for good. Into that diminished, glittering, uncertain world came Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, popular, quick, warm, and quietly ambitious, in the particular way that showed itself as having no ambition at all. She was one of the most sought-after young women of her set, courted, admired, at the centre of every gathering she entered. She could have married comfortably within her own class and lived a long, agreeable life as the wife of some landed gentleman, entertaining and hunting and raising children in a house like the ones she had grown up in. That she did not, that she reached instead into the royal family itself, was the first great turn of her story. But it is important to hold, before that turn, the clear picture of who she was at the start. Not a princess, not an heiress on the vast scale. A charming, clever, land-rich girl from a Scottish castle, raised to a life in which money was invisible and warmth was power, standing at the edge of a world about to change beyond recognition. Everything the country would one day love about her was already present in that young woman. So was the ledger that no camera would ever be allowed to see. It simply had not yet been opened, and would not open until a scandal she had nothing to do with reached down and changed the whole shape of her life. Chapter 2. The prince she refused twice. Twice the shy second son of the king asked her to marry him, and twice she said no. The man was Prince Albert, Duke of York, known within the family as Bertie, the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. He was earnest, dutiful, and painfully afflicted with a stammer that turned every public sentence into an ordeal. He had none of the easy glamour of his elder brother. What he had was a total, humble, hopeless devotion to Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the sense of a man reaching above his own confidence toward a woman he could not quite believe would have him, and he pursued her with a patience that was, in the end, almost the whole of his case. Her hesitation was not a girl's coyness. It was clear-sighted fear, and it was entirely rational. Elizabeth understood, better perhaps than Bertie did, exactly what marrying into the royal family would mean. It would mean the end of freedom. It would mean a life lived inside a gilded routine, watched at every hour, constrained by protocol, owned in some measure by the institution she married into. It would mean giving up the warm, easy, private world of her own class for something colder and grander and far less free. She had seen enough of the court to grasp that the royal family was not a family in the ordinary sense at all. It was a firm, an office, a duty that never ended and never released you. And so she refused him, and then, when he asked a second time, she refused him again. What finally changed her mind is not fully knowable, and this account will not pretend to read a heart across 100 years. What can be said is that Bertie's devotion did not waver, that the steady pressure of a determined suitor and an approving court told over time, and that in the end she accepted him. They were married on the 26th of April 1923 at Westminster Abbey, and the reluctant girl from Glamis became Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York. On her way into the Abbey, she did something that would become part of her legend from the very first day. She stepped aside and laid her bridal bouquet on the grave of the unknown warrior, in memory of a brother lost in the war and of all the war's dead, a private act of grief that read to the watching public as pure and instinctive grace. The instinct for the gesture that would land, that would be remembered and loved, was already at work on her wedding day. As Duchess of York, she occupied a comfortable but distinctly secondary place, and it matters to see just how secondary it was, because the whole drama of her life turns on the fact that she was never meant to be queen. The centre of attention, the star of the royal family, the golden future of the monarchy, was not her husband. It was his elder brother Edward, the Prince of Wales, the most glamorous and famous royal figure in the world. Slim, restless, magnetic, endlessly photographed, the Prince of Wales was the coming king, adored by crowds wherever he went, the very image of modern royalty. Beside him, the stammering Duke of York and his charming wife were a supporting act. They were the spare, and the spare's wife, not the heir. Their function was to support, to fill in the engagements the Prince of Wales could not be bothered with, to raise a family, and to remain decorously in the background while the golden brother carried the future of the crown on his own shoulders. For most of the 1920s and into the 30s, that is exactly what they did, and they did it well. 2 daughters were born, Elizabeth in 1926 and Margaret in 1930, and the Yorks became known, insofar as they were publicly known at all, as a warm and happy domestic unit, a family tucked away from the harshest glare. It was, by the standards of that grand and chilly family, a genuinely close and affectionate home, and the closeness was real, one of the true and unfeigned things in a life that would come to contain a great deal of careful performance. The 2 girls grew up loved and secure, and it was into that settled small world, ordered and private and safe, that a governess named Marion Crawford would shortly come to help raise them, giving 16 years of her life to the 2 princesses in the belief that she was part of the family. The bitter importance of that arrangement lay far in the future. For now, it was simply a happy nursery in a happy house. The Duchess performed her public duties with a grace that won quiet affection wherever she appeared. She carried out the steady round of public duties expected of a royal duchess, and everywhere the same thing happened. The same warmth that had steadied wounded soldiers at Glamis, now doing its patient work on crowds who had come to see royalty and went away having felt personally greeted. The place she occupied in those years is easy to misread from the far side of everything that came after, and the truth of it repays a moment's care. The royal family she had married into was, and understood itself to be, a working institution with a strict order of precedence, and in that order, the Yorks came a long way down. The old king, George V, and Queen Mary sat at the top. Then came the dazzling heir, the Prince of Wales, on whom every hope and every camera was trained. Only after all of them came Bertie and his wife, useful, dutiful, and firmly in the second rank, sent to the engagements that mattered less and photographed a good deal less often. A tour of the far dominions, the opening of a bridge in a provincial town, a hospital ward in the rain, these were the work of the spare, and the Yorks did that work without complaint and without expectation of anything more. But she was not preparing to be queen. There was no earthly reason to think she ever would be. If the story had run as everyone confidently expected, she would have lived out her days as a much-loved duchess, aunt to the future sovereign, a footnote of grace in the larger royal narrative. The Prince of Wales would become king, would marry a suitable princess, would father heirs of his own, and the line of succession would flow through him and his children. The Yorks and their 2 small girls would recede a little further into the background with each passing year, honoured and comfortable and permanently secondary. That was the plan the whole of Britain assumed. That was the future she had married into, eyes open, having weighed the loss of her freedom against the safety of a secondary royal life. And in that secondary life she was, by all accounts, content. The York household was a warm and ordered place, close in a way the wider royal family was not, and she was very good at the work it asked of her. She had found a role that suited her exactly, important enough to matter, sheltered enough to allow a private happiness, grand enough to satisfy without swallowing her whole. Had the world held to its expected shape, she would have grown old inside that comfortable arrangement, and the darker capacities that her later life revealed, the long memory for an injury, the appetite that never checked itself, might never have found the room to grow. It was the sudden, unwanted enlargement of her life, the throwing open of every door she had chosen to keep closed, that gave those capacities their stage. The abdication did not create the woman. It released her. But in accepting Bertie, she had done more than marry a man. She had stepped inside the walls. She was in the family now, in the firm, bound to the institution she had feared and finally chosen. And she had brought all her gifts in with her. The charm that had warmed convalescent soldiers now warmed the crowds at every royal engagement. The instinct for the landing gesture, the bouquet on the grave, was hers to deploy at will. And the deepest assumption of her childhood, that money was invisible and cost was somebody else's problem, had come inside the palace walls with her too, into a family whose wealth ran on a scale her own comfortable earldom had never approached. The bargain she had struck looked modest and safe. It was about to be torn up entirely by a crisis she had no part in making. A crisis that would take everything she had carefully declined and place it, without warning, directly into her hands. Chapter 3. The Brother Who Changed Everything. In December of 1936, the king gave up his throne for a divorced American woman, and a burden that no one had prepared for landed on a man who had never wanted it. King George V had died in January of that year, and the glamorous Prince of Wales had become King Edward VIII. He had also, by then, fallen completely under the spell of Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American woman. For a king who was also, as sovereign, the supreme governor of the Church of England, marriage to a twice-divorced woman was constitutionally impossible. The government of the day would not accept it. The Church would not accept it. The dominions of the empire would not accept it. And Edward, forced at last to choose between the crown and the woman, chose the woman. The speed and the shock of it are hard to recover now, when the abdication has hardened into a familiar story with a known ending. At the time, it was a genuine and terrifying crisis for the whole institution of the monarchy. A reigning king, crowned in all but the final ceremony, anointed as the supreme governor of the national church, was proposing to marry a twice-divorced woman, and when he could not have both her and the throne, he simply put the throne down and walked away from it. Nothing quite like it had happened in the whole long history of the English and British crown. It raised, in the sharpest possible form, the question of what the monarchy was even for, whether the vow of duty at its centre meant anything at all if a king could abandon it for a private love. Into that vacuum of confidence and fear stepped the stammering Duke of York and his wife, unready and unwilling, thrust forward for one reason only, that there was no one else left to do it, and the crown had to be caught before it struck the ground. She would carry the memory of that catching for the rest of her life, and she would never let anyone forget, least of all herself, who it was that had let the crown fall in the first place. On the 11th of December 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication and gave up the throne of the United Kingdom and its empire in order to marry Wallis Simpson. It was the gravest crisis the monarchy had faced in living memory, a genuine threat to the stability of the crown itself, and it fell in a single stroke onto the shoulders of the shy second son. Bertie, the Duke of York, the stammering brother who had spent his entire life in the shadow of the golden heir, became King George VI, and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the girl who had refused royal life twice before accepting a prince who was never meant to reign, became Queen Consort of the United Kingdom and its empire. She had not sought it. That much is true, and it is important to say it plainly. The crown came to her sideways, through a scandal she had no hand in creating, and she took it up out of duty rather than any hunger for the throne. But from the moment it came, she formed a conviction that would harden into the central grudge of her long life. She believed that Edward's abdication had been an act of pure selfishness that broke his brother. She believed that the crown had been thrown at a man too frail to bear it, a man whose stammer and whose delicate nerves made the ceaseless public performance of kingship an agony, and that the strain of the role Edward had so casually abandoned would wear her husband down and carry him to an early grave. She was not entirely wrong about the strain, but the conviction went far beyond any measured judgment into something colder, harder, and more lasting than analysis. Her biographer, Ingrid Seward, would later write that the Queen's attitude to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as Edward and Wallis became, bordered on a vendetta. The word matters here, because it is the engine of so much that follows, and because it is genuinely disputed. Some who knew her well denied that she was embittered at all. The Duke of Grafton, close to her for many years, is on record saying that she never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor. So the inner temperature of the grudge is a matter on which honest witnesses disagreed, and this account will not pretend to settle what it cannot know. What is not in dispute is the pattern of the conduct, sustained without a break across the rest of her very long life. She referred to Wallis Simpson, when she referred to her at all, simply as that woman. Wallis, in her turn, is said to have mocked the new queen behind her back with the nickname Cookie. And on the one matter that might have softened the whole long exile of the Windsors, the granting of the royal style Her Royal Highness to the Duchess, the new queen is very widely credited with ensuring that it never happened. That single denial, small on paper, poisoned relations between the two households for the rest of both women's lives. Look at what the abdication had actually done to her, because the size of the shock explains the depth of the grievance. It had taken the modest, careful bargain of her marriage and torn it to pieces. She had married the spare and woken to find herself married to the king. She had feared the loss of freedom that came with royal life lived at its edge, and now she stood at its dead centre, queen consort of a global empire, watched by the whole world. Her two small daughters had become, overnight, heirs to the throne, their childhoods rewritten in an afternoon. Her stammering, dreading husband had been pushed onto the one stage he could not bear. Everything she had so deliberately declined was now hers, and every bit of it had come at the price of her husband's peace and, as she was sure, his health, and eventually his life. Out of that shock, she built the thing the whole country would come to love. She threw herself into the work of shoring up a shaken monarchy, of turning the reluctant, halting King George VI into a figure the nation could believe in and rally behind, of standing at his side at every step so that his weakness never once had to show alone. She coaxed him through his speeches, steadied him in public, and lent him, out of her own bottomless reserves, the confidence he lacked. In this, she was magnificent, and the work she did was real and hard and largely hidden. A shy and stammering man had been placed at the head of a nation and an empire, expected to speak, to appear, to embody a confidence he did not feel. And it fell to her to make that possible, day after day, to be the strength that let his weakness pass unseen. The country would come to love her for the smile and the courage, but the deepest and most demanding labour of her early queenship was this quieter thing, the propping up of a frightened husband so that the monarchy itself did not seem to falter. It was devotion, and it was duty, and it was also, inseparably, the same instinct for management and performance that ran through everything she did. And she began, in the very same motion, to keep the private account that this whole story is about. Every slight was entered in it. Every injury was remembered and filed and never written off. The man who had abandoned the throne, the woman he had abandoned it for, would never be forgiven. Not across 60 years, not on any deathbed, not for anything. Not the charm that faced the public and the memory that faced her enemies now ran side by side within her, and they would run that way, in perfect parallel, until the day she died. The coronation was still to come. So was the war that would seal her legend into the national memory forever. But the grievance that would outlast every person it touched was already fixed. On the 11th of December, 1936, the day her brother-in-law handed her a crown she had never asked to wear. Chapter 4. The Queen, the country fell for. When the bombs fell on London, she refused to leave, and a nation frightened for its very survival took her permanently and unconditionally to its heart. But before the war, there was the crowning, and the crowning mattered, because it was the first great set piece of the image she would spend the rest of her life building and defending. She and King George VI were crowned together at Westminster Abbey on the 12th of May, 1937, on the very date that had originally been fixed for the coronation of the brother who had walked away. The symbolism was lost on no one. The steady, dutiful couple were being installed in the exact slot the golden brother had vacated, and the whole vast ceremony carried a single message to the country and the world, the message of continuity, of reassurance, of a monarchy shaken to its foundations and now visibly repaired and carried safely on. The role she was stepping into had changed its nature within her own lifetime, and she grasped the change instinctively. The monarchy of the old Queen, Victoria, had still carried something of real power and remoteness about it, a distant majesty that ruled by being unreachable. The monarchy of the 20th century could no longer trade on distance. It survived, if it survived at all, by being loved, by making itself felt as a warm and present part of ordinary people's lives, and that shift demanded exactly the gifts she possessed in such abundance. She was, in a sense, the perfect monarch for the new age, except that she was only the consort, standing beside a husband who had the crown and lacked the ease. So she supplied the ease for both of them, becoming the warmth that the whole institution needed and that her shy husband could not provide. And in doing so, she made herself, from the very start of the reign, indispensable in a way that no mere consort had ever quite been before. She understood ceremony, and the deeper thing beneath ceremony, as few public figures in the country's history ever have. She understood that a monarchy does not rule by force or by argument, but by feeling, by the sense it gives ordinary people of something larger and older and steadier than their own small lives. And she possessed, ready-made and perfected since girlhood, the precise instrument that such a monarchy most needs, which is warmth. Where her husband was shy and halting, she was radiant and easy. Where the machinery of state was cold and remote, she was a smile, a kind word, a look that reached across a crowd and made a total stranger feel personally seen and personally greeted. From the very first days of the reign, she was the warmth of the firm, the human face that made a cold institution lovable, and she played that role with a completeness and a discipline that never once cracked in public across the next 65 years. Then came the war, and the war made her forever. When the Blitz began and German bombs fell night after night upon London, the King and Queen did not retreat to the safety of the countryside, as they easily could have done, and as many urged them to do. They stayed in London. They went out into the bombed streets, walking through rubble and broken glass, and they visited the districts that had been hit hardest, talking with people who had lost their homes, their possessions, and their families in the night's raids. The sight of the King and Queen picking their way through the wreckage of an ordinary street, unhurried, unguarded, sharing in some visible measure the danger and the grief of the poorest parts of the capital, did something to the national feeling that no speech and no proclamation could have done. It said that the woman in the palace stood under the same sky as the woman in the terraced house, and a nation under fire believed it and loved her for it, and never afterward stopped. There is a hard truth about modern monarchy folded inside those wartime walkabouts, and she understood it more completely than almost anyone of her age. A crown in the 20th century could no longer command loyalty by right or by force. It had to earn loyalty by feeling, by making millions of ordinary people believe that the distant grand families somehow belonged to them and shared in their lives. That belief cannot be decreed. It has to be manufactured day after day out of gestures and images and small human moments that read, to the watching public, as entirely spontaneous. She was, quite simply, the greatest natural craftsman of that manufacture the modern monarchy ever produced. Every walkabout, every kind word to a bombed-out family, every carefully unhurried pause in a ruined street, was at once a genuine act of human warmth and a perfectly judged act of royal public relations, and the fact that it was both at once, always both, is the single key to understanding her whole long life. This was the charm at its highest and its very best, and it deserves its full due before the private account is opened any further. In the darkest hour of the country's history, her particular genius, the gift first noticed in a small girl at Glamis and first put to work on wounded soldiers in one war, did real and important and measurable good in another. It steadied people. It gave a frightened and exhausted population a figure to hold on to, a point of warmth and courage that did not flinch. Her value to the war effort was real, counted in morale, in the willingness of ordinary people to endure another night and another. And it is no exaggeration to say that her charm was a genuine national asset in a time of mortal danger. The image forged in those years, the small, brave, smiling queen who would not leave her people while they suffered, was true. It was also, from the very beginning, a performance shaped and tended and maintained with an absolute and unrelenting discipline. And both of those things were the case at once. When the war was at last won, that image did not fade with the danger that had created it. It hardened into something permanent, a fixed place in the national heart that she would occupy for the next 57 years. She had given the country a version of itself that it wanted to believe in, steady and kind and unbroken under fire, and the country repaid her by loving her without condition for the rest of her life, and by declining, ever, to look too closely at anything that might have complicated the picture. That unspoken bargain, struck in the rubble of the Blitz, is the foundation of everything that follows. She would spend the next half a century drawing on the credit of those years, and the credit never ran out, however she chose to live behind the smile. By the end of the war, she stood among the most beloved figures in the entire country, and the affection never faded, never cooled, for the whole of the rest of her long life. She had become the balcony queen, the waving figure in pastel and feathers, the human warmth at the very centre of the cold, grand machine of monarchy. And here, at the summit of the rise, the two stories of her life fully separate and begin to run in parallel for the next half a century. There is the public woman, the nation's darling, the brave queen of the Blitz, adored without reservation or condition by a country that felt it knew her. And there is the private woman, keeper of grudges, spender without limit or reckoning, mistress of a household that ran year after year on money nobody ever counted. The country would only ever be shown the first of these women. The second ran on quietly underneath, entered day by day, injury by injury and pound by pound, in an account the public was never permitted to open. The war ended in triumph. The king, worn down exactly as she had long feared he would be, moved slowly toward the early death she had dreaded from the day the crown was forced upon him, and the queen, radiant in public and untouchable in the nation's affections, was about to enter the strange, long phase of her life in which the spending, the grudges, and the pleasures would all have their fullest and freest possible run. The rise was complete. She was loved as few people in the whole history of the country have ever been loved. Now the private account, which had opened so quietly on the day of the abdication, was ready at last to fill. Chapter 5. The Household That Never Counted. Parliament gave her a great sum of money each year to live on, and each and every year she spent several times more than that. The public allowance came through the civil list, the money voted by Parliament to fund the working members of the royal family, and hers ran to about £643,000 a year. To almost anyone in the country that was a fortune beyond serious imagining, a sum that could have bought a whole street of houses and kept 100 families in comfort for years. To the Queen Mother, it was merely a starting point, the floor beneath her spending rather than any kind of ceiling. The cost of actually running her household, spread across her residences and her staff, and her entertaining and her wardrobe and her stable, was estimated at somewhere between £1 and £2 million a year. The gap between what the state provided and what she actually spent was not a small annual overrun to be trimmed and apologised for. It was the settled and permanent condition of her life. Where the money went can be traced room by room, and the trail runs first and most heavily into houses. She kept Clarence House in the heart of London as her principal residence from 1953, a great mansion run to the standard of a small palace. She kept the Castle of Mey on the remote far north coast of Scotland. She kept Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park and Birkhall on the Balmoral estate in the Highlands. Each of these was not a modest bolt hole, but a full working establishment, with its own staff, its own kitchens, its own gardens, its own stables and cellars, its own unbroken standard of hospitality that never once dropped whether she was in residence or 100 miles away. A great house does not switch itself off when its owner leaves. The fires are still laid, the flowers are still cut and arranged, the silver is still polished, the lawns are still mown, the wages are still paid, week in and week out, through every season of the year, whether anyone of consequence is there to see it or not. The system that paid for all of this explains a great deal, because its very design was what made her spending possible. British monarchs do not, in the modern age, simply own the country's money. Under a long-standing arrangement, the sovereign hands the vast revenues of the Crown's hereditary lands to the government, and in exchange, the state pays the working royals a fixed annual sum, historically through what was called the civil list, to cover the costs of their public duties. On top of that, public money sits the privy purse, the sovereign's own large private income, drawn from ancient estates, which pays for whatever the public grant does not. The whole structure was built to keep the monarchy funded, dignified, and above the grubby business of ordinary money. What it also did, in her particular case, was to place a woman of unlimited appetite inside a system with no natural break, funded from two directions at once, public and private, with a daughter of colossal wealth standing behind both. The design assumed restraint at the top. She supplied none, and the design had no answer for that. It went, in vast quantity, into people. She kept a large personal household, dozens upon dozens of servants distributed across her 4 residences, pages and footmen and housemaids and dressers and cooks and chauffeurs and gardeners and the private secretaries and clerks who ran her office and her diary. Every single one of them was paid, housed, fed, uniformed, and kept to a standard that matched the grandeur of the setting they served in. This was, in miniature, the old aristocratic economy she had been born into, the world of Glamis reproduced on an even grander scale, an entire small society of dependent labour arranged so that one woman at the top of it could live without ever touching a task or seeing a price. It went into clothes. She favoured the couturier Norman Hartnell and dressed with a deliberate, instantly recognisable, and frankly enormous extravagance, the pastels and the feathers, and the long sweeping coats and the matching hats that made her a visible point of warmth and colour in any crowd on any grey British day. The look was a working part of the image, and the image was expensive to build and expensive to keep. It went into entertaining, into the fine wines and the vintage champagnes and the long lunches and the grand dinners at which she was, by universal agreement, the most charming and sought-after host in the country. And it went into flowers, always and everywhere into flowers, great banks and arrangements of them filling every room of every house, replaced constantly, a running expense in itself that would have staggered an ordinary household, and that she regarded as no more remarkable than the air. Set the numbers side by side, and the impossibility of it becomes plain. A public allowance of about £643,000 a year. A household costing between £1 and £2 million a year to run. 4 principal residences, each of them fully staffed all year round. Dozens of personal servants on the books. A wardrobe from one of the most expensive couturiers in London. And, running alongside all of it, a racing stable that at its height held more than 20 horses in training. There was no year in which the sums came anywhere close to balancing, and there was no attempt, ever, to make them balance. The difference between what came in and what went out was simply found, from somewhere, quietly, year after year after year, decade after decade. What makes the spending so telling is that none of it was folly of the ordinary spendthrift kind. She did not gamble it away, or lose it to swindlers, or pour it into ruinous schemes. Every pound of it went on the maintenance of a certain idea of how a queen should live, an idea formed in the grand houses of her Edwardian childhood and never once revised across 100 years. The flowers had to be fresh and everywhere. The houses had to be kept to the mark whether she was in them or not. The table had to be the best, the wines the finest, the staff sufficient to make it all appear effortless. It was extravagance in the service of a standard, the standard of a vanished aristocratic world that she alone still fully embodied, and she would sooner have run any debt than let that standard slip by a single degree. The overdraft, in that sense, was the cost of her refusing, for 60 years, to live in the reduced century she actually inhabited. The somewhere, in the end, was her daughter. The Queen made up the shortfall out of the privy purse, the sovereign's own private income, topping up her mother's spending from the far deeper pockets of the crown itself. And whatever the privy purse did not cover was borrowed, against the unimpeachable standing of the borrower, from the private bank that had served the royal family for generations. The Queen Mother was, in this crucial respect, a woman with no external check upon her spending of the kind that governs and disciplines every ordinary life. An ordinary person who spends several times their income very quickly meets a wall, a bank that says no more, a reckoning that forces a hard and humbling change of habits. She never once met that wall, across 101 years, because the person standing on the other side of it was the wealthiest woman in the country, and that woman was her own devoted daughter, who would no more have refused her mother than flown to the moon. Those who handled her money spent their careers describing the effect of a life lived this way. She had, in the phrase that was repeated again and again, the haziest notion of what things actually cost. She was not extravagant in the shallow manner of someone who knows the price of a luxury to the penny and pays it gladly for the pleasure of showing off. She was extravagant in a far deeper and more innocent manner, the manner of a woman to whom price was simply not a category of thought at all. A woman raised from her cradle in a world where the machinery of cost was hidden and then placed, for the following 60 years, in a unique position where it never once had to become visible to her. The Daily Mail, reaching for a comparison grand enough to capture it, called her the most expensive royal to maintain since Marie Antoinette. The line is colour rather than accountancy, and it should be taken as colour and no more. But it caught something entirely real. Here was a private person spending public money and royal money together on a scale that answered to no ordinary rule of household economy, and doing it not in any spirit of defiance, but in a serene and lifelong unawareness that any such rule could possibly apply to her. This is the foundation upon which the whole of the later story is built. Long before there was ever a £4 million overdraft, there was a way of living that made such an overdraft not merely possible, but inevitable. The debt, when at last it came, was no scandal that ambushed her out of nowhere. It was the natural and predictable endpoint of a household that never counted, underwritten by a family that never once made her count, sustained by a charm so complete and so total that the very country which paid for a great deal of it adored her without ever being shown, or thinking to ask for, a single line of the bill. Chapter 6. The horses she loved to ruin. In 1949, a horse of hers won a race at Fontwell Park, and with that single victory, she became the first English queen to win a race in Britain since Queen Anne, more than 230 years before. The horse was called Monaveen, and the win lit a passion that would burn for the rest of her life and become the one form of her lavish spending that the whole country loved every bit as much as she did. Horse racing, and jump racing in particular, the muddy, dangerous, deeply unfashionable winter sport of the steeplechase, became her great enthusiasm, her private joy, and a continuous and very considerable drain on her purse for the following half a century and more. She came to ownership at the very end of the 1940s, and once she had come to it, she never left it again. Her first trainer was Major Peter Cazalet, who trained her horses from that first win in 1949 until his death in 1973, a partnership that lasted nearly a quarter of a century. After Cazalet came Fulk Walwyn, and under her trainers she built one of the best-known and most successful strings of jumping horses in the entire country. Over the whole span of her racing life, she owned the winners of 449 races, a total that some admiring accounts round up to nearly 500. At the very height of it, in the 1960s, she kept as many as 22 horses in training at one time, a stable to rival any private owner in the land. In the season of 1964 and 65, her horses won 27 races between them, and she finished that year as the third most successful racehorse owner in the whole of Britain. The horses themselves became genuine characters in the long story of her life, known to her not as investments or as ornaments, but as individuals with tempers and habits and histories. There was Game Spirit, who carried her colours to 21 victories. There was Chow II, with 17. There was Macaldar with 15, and the Rip with 13, and Double Star, and a whole long succession of others whose names and whose form she knew as intimately as she knew the names of her own grandchildren. She followed them with a devotion that was entirely and transparently genuine, and here lies one of the real complications in any fair portrait of the woman. The racing was not vanity of the cold and calculating kind at all. It was love, plain and uncomplicated love. It was the one part of her enormously expensive life that she pursued for pure private pleasure rather than for public image, and the country, a nation of racegoers and punters and Saturday afternoon dreamers, loved her the more for it, without a trace of resentment. There is a detail here that cuts hard against the easy picture of a gambling grande dame throwing fortunes across the betting ring, and it deserves to be set down clearly and allowed to stand. For all her lifelong devotion to the turf, the Queen Mother is documented as having never once placed a bet in her entire life. She was not in it for the wager, and she took no interest in the odds. She had the racing commentaries piped directly into Clarence House, so that she could follow her own horses from London on the many days when she could not be at the course in person. And she took her deep and real joy from the running and the winning and the animals themselves, from the sight of her colours coming up the hill in front, and never from money staked and money won. The most expensive woman in Britain to maintain, in the one arena of her life where she might most easily have gambled away another fortune, did not gamble at all. The spending was all on the horses themselves, on their training and their upkeep and their transport, and the whole vast apparatus of a great racing stable. And that spending, year upon year, was expense more than enough. The single most famous moment of her entire racing life was not one of her 449 wins. It was a loss so strange and so cruel that it passed permanently into the language of the sport. In the Grand National of 1956, the greatest and most punishing steeplechase in the world, her horse, Devon Loch, ridden by the jockey Dick Francis, was leading the whole field as the race came to its climax. He was clear by 5 lengths, with only 40 yards of flat ground remaining between him and the winning post, and the race was as good as run and won. And then, in front of a vast roaring crowd and a watching nation, Devon Loch, for no reason anyone has ever been able to fully explain, suddenly leapt into the air as though clearing a fence that was not there, came down flat upon his belly with his legs splayed beneath him, and could not go on. The horse that had been behind him swept past and took the race. It remains, 70 years later, one of the strangest and most heartbreaking moments in the entire history of British sport, and the mystery of what passed through the animal's mind in those final yards has never been solved. Every kind of explanation has been offered across the decades since. A sudden cramp seizing the great muscles of his hindquarters, a confusing shadow thrown across the course by the water jump, a wall of noise from the roaring crowd that startled and unbalanced him at the fatal instant. A heart attack was ruled out, since the horse recovered and stood within moments. But no single theory has ever fully satisfied, and Devon Loch's collapse has passed into the language precisely because it has no ending, a victory certain one moment and gone the next, snatched away 40 yards from home for no reason anyone could ever name. Her reaction, in that public moment of bitter and undeserved loss, is perhaps the most revealing single thing about her that the racing world ever witnessed. She did not rage. She did not weep. She did not curse her luck or blame the jockey. She turned at once to comfort the devastated stable staff and the stricken young rider, and she said quite simply that she supposed that was racing. Oh, that's racing. 3 small words, and they carried within them the whole of her public manner, the grace held steady under the blow, the absolute refusal to let private feeling show in public, the trained instinct to convert even a personal catastrophe into a moment of composure that everyone present would remember and admire and repeat for the rest of their lives. It was the charm working under maximum pressure, the very same charm that had steadied wounded soldiers and a blitzed city, now steadying a racecourse full of shocked and grieving people who had just watched her horse throw away the greatest prize in the sport 40 yards from home. The stable ran on, at full strength, for the rest of her very long life. By the time she died, she still kept about 12 horses in training, down from the 22 of her peak, but still a substantial and costly establishment for a woman well past 100 years of age. The racing was the acceptable, beloved, sunlit face of the fortune she poured out without counting, the warm public end of the very same open purse that also ran, quietly and continuously and out of all sight, deeper and deeper into the red at the bank. The country saw the horses, and it loved them, and it loved her for loving them. It helped, too, that of all the ways a rich woman might have spent a fortune, This was the one most calculated to endear her to ordinary people, though calculation had nothing to do with why she chose it. Jump racing was not the glittering, exclusive, top-hatted world of the flat. It was the people's end of the sport, run through the winter mud at small country courses, followed by working men in flat caps who put a few shillings on a Saturday. A world of cold afternoons and long odds and beloved brave horses that the whole nation could feel it shared in. A queen who loved that world, who stood in the rain to watch her steeplechasers and knew every one of them by name and grieved when they were hurt, was a queen the ordinary racegoer could take to his heart without a shred of resentment. The racing bound her to the public in a way that no amount of couture or entertaining ever could, and it did so precisely because it looked like the one part of her grand life that money had nothing to do with. What the country never saw was the account standing behind them, filling year by year with a debt that no win at Fontwell or on any other course in the land would ever come remotely close to covering. Chapter 7. The Man Who Never Knocked. One servant entered her private rooms without ever knocking for half a century, and he loved her past the very end of his own life. His name was William Talon, though the whole country, insofar as it knew him at all, knew him only as Backstairs Billy. He had come into royal service as a boy of just 15 in 1951, and over the following decades he rose to become page of the backstairs and steward at Clarence House, which meant in daily practice that he was the single closest continuous presence in the Queen Mother's life across decade after decade after decade. He was on duty from early in the morning until the moment she went to bed at night. He entered her private rooms without knocking, a liberty granted to almost no one. He bought, on her behalf, and out of his own knowledge of her wishes, the Christmas presents that she then gave to others. In 2001, he received his official clasp, marking 50 full years of royal service. And when she died the following spring, William Talon was left, by every single account, heartbroken in a way from which he never truly recovered before his own death a few years later. The relationship between the Queen Mother and William Talon is the key that unlocks the thing this whole story turns upon, which is the charm and the question of what exactly it was for. Because the charm was real. That has to be stated plainly, and it has to be given its full and honest weight, or the entire portrait collapses into a cheap caricature that does justice neither to her nor to the people who knew her. She inspired in the people closest to her not mere professional loyalty, but genuine love, deep and lasting and uncalculating love of the kind that William Talon carried for her across 50 years of daily service and did not put down when she died. The warmth that the public saw and adored on the balcony was the very same warmth that the household felt in the private rooms behind the door. And it was not a thing switched on for the cameras and switched off again once they had gone. Inside her own house, to the men and women who served her most closely, she was magical company, funny and kind, and endlessly interested in them. A delight to be near, the best employer in the world. The devotion she inspired was not the ordinary loyalty of a good servant to a fair master. It was something closer to love, and it lasted whole lifetimes. Men and women gave her 40 and 50 years of their lives and counted the giving a privilege. They guarded her secrets, arranged her comforts, and grieved her when she went, as they would have grieved their own mothers. William Talon, weeping for her years after her death, was only the most visible example of a devotion that ran right through her household from top to bottom. That capacity to be so completely loved by those who knew her best is the strongest single piece of evidence that the warmth at the center of her was entirely real, and it is exactly why the coldness that ran alongside it is so hard to hold in the same frame. And yet the same faculty that earned all that love was also, unmistakably and inseparably, a working instrument, deployed with an artist's unerring precision upon everyone who ever came within its range. The stories that survive of her charm are, when you look at them closely, stories of technique quite as much as stories of feeling. There is the famous exchange with the playwright Noel Coward at a grand and glittering gala evening, when the two of them found themselves seated where they could watch a long line of tall and handsome young guardsmen on ceremonial duty, and Coward let his appreciative eye travel slowly along the row of them. The Queen Mother caught the look at once, and she leaned in and murmured to him that she wouldn't, if she were him, because they counted them before they put them out. The wit is perfect, quick and warm, and just faintly wicked, and it did precisely what her wit always did, which was to bind the person in front of her to her with a bright thread of shared and slightly conspiratorial delight, so that they went away feeling they had been let in on something. There is the manner she had with the very humblest of her outdoor staff, the gillies and keepers and gardeners on her Scottish estates, which was the identical manner transposed into a country quay. To one gillie helping her with her casting on the river, she is remembered saying, cheerfully, after a badly botched throw, that she had made a complete pig's ear of that, and asking him to simply shout the word Christmas the next time she made a muddle of a cast, so that she would know at once to correct herself without any awkwardness on either side. To another of her Scottish men she said, in passing, that he reminded her of her late husband, which the man treasured, rightly, as one of the very greatest compliments of his whole life. These are small things, tiny human moments, and their smallness is exactly the point of them. She spent her charm upon the gardener and the fishing guide, every bit as lavishly and as sincerely as she spent it upon the Duke and the President and the Archbishop. And the result of a lifetime of spending it that way was a household and a wide network of estate workers who would cheerfully have walked through fire for her, and several of whom, in effect, gave her their entire lives. The world that William Talon belonged to is almost gone now, and it needs a moment's description, because the loyalty it produced is central to how she lived. A great royal household in her day was a whole society in itself, arranged in a hierarchy every bit as strict as the one she had grown up with at Glamis, with the senior officials at the top, and the pages and footmen and maids arranged in careful ranks below. To enter that world young, as Talon did at 15, was to give your life to it, to live inside its rhythms, to take your entire identity from your closeness to the person at its centre. And the first and deepest rule of that world, the rule on which the whole thing rested, was silence. What was seen behind the door stayed behind the door. A servant carried the private life of the family sealed within them, and the reward for that discretion was a place, a belonging, a share in the reflected warmth of the most glamorous household in the country. Men like Talon kept that faith absolutely, to the grave and beyond it. The tragedy of the one servant who broke it, who told, was still to come in this story, and the ferocity of what was done to her only makes sense against the depth of the silence that everyone else kept. The interpretation this account offers, carefully and entirely without cynicism, is that the warmth and the strategy were one and the same act, indivisible, a single gift doing two jobs at once. She was never a cold woman performing a warmth she did not feel. She was a genuinely and deeply warm woman whose warmth had, since her earliest childhood at Glamis, always also been the precise tool by which she got her way, held her position, disarmed her critics, and made herself so thoroughly beloved as to be, in the end, entirely untouchable. The charm that made William Talon love her faithfully for 50 years was the very same charm that made a wartime nation adore her, was the very same charm that allowed her, when she coldly chose to freeze a human being out of her life forever and suffer no cost whatever for it in the eyes of a watching world. It was at one and the same time her genius and her armour, and the devoted household that loved her so completely and so uncritically was also, though not one of them would ever have dreamed of putting it in such terms, the loyal front line of a lifelong campaign to be adored, a campaign that she began as a girl and that she never, across 101 years, came anywhere close to losing. That campaign had a price, and the price ran directly through the same beautiful houses that William Talon kept so faithfully. The devotion, the warmth, the wit, the magical company, the pig's ear and the shouted Christmas and the 50-year clasp. All of it unfolded inside grand establishments that cost far more to run than the state ever provided, sustained by borrowing that grew a little larger and a little heavier with every passing year. William Talon polished the silver and arranged the flowers and bought the presents and guarded the unknocked door of a woman whose private accounts, had they ever once been laid before the adoring public that paid so much of the bill, would have told a very different story from the one the charm existed, above all else, to make sure nobody ever thought to ask about. Chapter 8. A Drink and All Afternoon to Reign. The gin-and-Dubonnet came at midday, and she would not be hurried toward it, or away from it, or through it, by any living soul on earth. The Queen Mother's enjoyment of a drink is one of the best documented and most affectionately told parts of her entire private legend, and it needs to be handled with real care because it sits precisely on the border between the true and the wildly exaggerated. What the people who actually served her day after day describe is a sociable, lifelong, entirely controlled and functional pleasure in good drink, taken at its proper appointed hours. What later and far more sensational accounts would eventually turn that mild pleasure into is something that her own family and the palace itself angrily and specifically rejected. And the whole difference between those two pictures matters a great deal to any honest telling. The routine, as recalled in detail by the very people who mixed and carried her drinks for her, ran through the day like a gentle series of small, fixed ceremonies. At midday there was gin and Dubonnet, mixed carefully to her particular taste, at a ratio of 2 parts, gin to 1 part of the sweet red aperitif. At lunch there was wine. In the evening there was a dry martini, which she was well known to prefer to mix with her own hands rather than leave entirely to a servant to prepare. The writer Nancy Mitford, recording one particular lunch in her diary, noted the Queen Mother taking 2 dry martinis before the meal, wine all the way through it, and port to finish afterward. Across an enormously long life, these small habits stayed remarkably consistent, a set of fixed and civilized pleasures that punctuated her ordered days and never seemed to touch her health in the slightest, given that she went on to reach the age of 101. The single most quoted line of the entire subject captures the true tone of it exactly. At a family lunch, when the Queen requested a second glass of wine, her mother is said to have leaned across toward her and asked, gently and with perfect comic timing, whether that was quite wise, my dear, given that she had to reign all afternoon. The joke is warm and sharp and affectionate all at once, and it tells you almost everything about the place that drink actually held in her world, which was the place of enjoyment and wit and sociability rather than the place of trouble or need. That is the register in which the people who genuinely knew her always placed it, and it is almost certainly the plain truth of the matter. Against that affectionate and well-attested picture, there came, in time, a far harsher one, and the collision between the two is one to set out plainly, because it is a small case study in exactly how the private life of a beloved public figure gets fought over after the fact. In later years, an author, Lady Colin Campbell, published claims that painted the Queen Mother's drinking in far darker and more extreme colours, using language that reached as far as describing her as an insane drunk. The palace reacted with open and unusual anger to the characterization, and so, more tellingly still, did the people who had actually been closest to her in life. Her niece, Margaret Rhodes, who had served for years as her lady-in-waiting and who knew her private daily habits as intimately as anyone then living, pushed back firmly and specifically on the caricature. She said that the Queen Mother in fact rarely drank gin and tonic at all, that she much preferred a gin martini, which she generally made for herself, and that the lurid portrait of a heavy-drinking, out-of-control woman was simply and flatly wrong. The honest position, and the one this account holds firmly to, is that a warm and sociable fondness for a well-made drink taken at the proper hour is thoroughly and richly documented, while the far darker framing of alcoholism is genuinely disputed, was deeply resented by her family, and must not be asserted here as established fact. The quarrel over her drinking is a small window onto a much larger difficulty, which is how anyone ever comes to know the private truth of a life lived so completely inside a performance. The people who loved and served her had every reason to guard the gentle version, the twinkling old lady with her midday glass. The authors who came later had every reason to reach for the lurid one, the secret drunk behind the smile, because scandal sells and reverence does not. The truth, as so often with her, sits quietly between the two camps, documented in the small, consistent details of a daily routine, and defended by those who actually watched her live it. What the argument really reveals is how fiercely her image was fought over even in the smallest things, and how much work it took, from all sides, to keep the real woman hidden behind the one the public had agreed to love. Around the drink, there sat the other small and telling tyranny of her private manner, which was her relationship with time. She was famously, serenely, and immovably unpunctual, and she simply would not be rushed by anyone or anything. The household did not correct her lateness, because the household could not correct her lateness. The household instead arranged and rearranged itself endlessly around that lateness, built its entire daily rhythm to absorb it, and learned, as a first principle of service, that the Queen Mother arrived precisely when the Queen Mother chose to arrive, and that no clock, no schedule, no fixed appointment, and no waiting dignitary, however grand, would ever move her so much as a single minute faster than she herself had decided to move. It was entirely of a piece with everything else about the way she lived her life. Just as money bent itself silently to her wishes, so too did time. The great institution adjusted itself, patiently and permanently, to her personal comfort. She did not, at any point across 65 years, adjust herself to the institution. There is a mild and very telling irony in the way that these two small private habits have come down to us in the national memory. The lateness and the drinking, which in almost any other public figure alive would read as plain self-indulgence and be judged accordingly, became, in her particular case, simply more warm colour in a beloved portrait, further charming evidence of a grand and twinkling old lady who lived exactly as she pleased, and who charmed the entire world into finding it all perfectly delightful. The very same country that would have tutted and shaken its head at an ordinary duchess for keeping a room full of important people waiting while she finished a leisurely second, Martini found precisely the same behaviour enchanting in her, a national treasure indulging herself. That was the immunity that the charm bought her, working even here, even upon these small and human private failings, quietly transforming what would have been faults in anyone else into mere facets of a national treasure. The same trick worked on a far larger canvas, and it is the pattern that the rest of this story simply repeats at higher and higher stakes. A small self-indulgence, a martini and a wait, was forgiven and even loved because the public face never slipped. And what worked for the small things worked, in exactly the same way and for exactly the same reason for the very large ones. The grudge held for 60 years, the servant cut dead for a lifetime, the millions of pounds of unpaid debt, all of it was carried by the same woman and covered by the same charm. And the country forgave all of it in advance, sight unseen, because it had decided long ago that she was delightful, and it never once revised the verdict. The lateness and the gin are the small, harmless, visible edge of a much larger truth about her, which is that being adored had freed her completely and permanently from consequence. Watch how the mechanism actually worked, because it is the same at every scale. A public figure does one thing that, in anyone else, would draw a frown, and the public has a choice. It can revise its warm opinion, or it can decide the behavior is charming and keep the opinion intact. With her, the country made the second choice every single time, without fail, for 65 years, because it had committed so completely to loving her that revising the verdict would have felt like a loss to itself. The martini became an endearing quirk. The lateness became grand character. And when the stakes rose from a kept martini to a kept grudge, from a late lunch to a cut-off governess to a £4 million debt, the same reflex simply held because it had never once been broken. The public had trained itself, across decades, to see only the lovable in her, and by the end, it could no longer see anything else, whatever the evidence might have said, had anyone thought to look. And underneath all of it, all the while, the private woman was steadily coming into the fullest freedom she would ever know. The war was long over and won. The reign of her daughter was firmly and safely established, and she was now moving in her stately and unhurried way toward the long half-century of widowhood in which the spending, the grudges, and the pleasures would all find their freest, least checked, and most complete expression. Every last part of it entered faithfully, day after day, in the account that the country was never once permitted to see. Chapter 9. The name she would not say. She called the woman who had taken her brother-in-law's crown simply that woman, and she held the coldness perfectly steady for 60 years. The grudge against the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, against Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, was the longest sustained act of her entire private life, and it is the single clearest piece of evidence the record offers for the vengeful half of the title this video carries. It began on the very day of the abdication, and it did not soften or end at any graveside or in any final illness. It ran, cold and constant and unrelenting, from the winter of 1936 all the way to the end of her days, more than 60 years of a refusal that never once wavered. The mechanism of the grudge was refusal, expressed not in shouting or in public denunciation, but in a perfect and permanent withholding. She refused the Windsors' warmth. She refused them welcome. She refused them the small human recognitions that might have eased the long decades of their exile from the family and the country. And above all else, she is very widely credited with having refused Wallis Simpson the one thing that the Duke wanted most in all the world for his wife, which was the royal style, Her Royal Highness. When Edward married Wallis after giving up his throne for her, the question of whether the new Duchess of Windsor would be granted that style became a running and open sore between the exiled couple and the family that had inherited the crown from them. The style was withheld. Wallis was made the Duchess of Windsor, but she was never Her Royal Highness, never curtsied to as a royal woman, never fully admitted to the rank her husband had been born into, and the Duke took the denial as a wound that stayed open and bleeding for the rest of his life. The new Queen is very generally held to have been the firm and immovable hand behind that refusal, and behind the wider royal policy of keeping the Windsors at the very coldest possible distance from the family, the court, and the throne. The denial of those three initials sounds, to a modern ear, like a small and technical thing, a quibble over a form of address. It was nothing of the kind. In the strict world of royal precedents, it was the difference between belonging and not belonging, between a woman before whom the household bowed and curtsied, and a woman before whom it did not. To withhold the style was to declare, formally and permanently, that Wallis was not truly one of them, that she stood forever outside the family she had married into, that no marriage and no passage of years would ever make her a royal woman. The Duke spent decades trying to have the decision reversed, and it was never reversed. Every time the exiled couple hoped for a thaw, for an invitation, for some small softening that might let them come in from the cold, they met the same still, smiling, immovable refusal, and behind it, they were sure, stood the sister-in-law who had never forgiven them and never would. There is a quiet cruelty in a grudge held that long and that consistently, and it deserves naming plainly, because it sits so strangely beside the public warmth. Most anger burns hot and then cools. Most grievances soften with the years, worn down by time and distance and death. Hers did not. Across 6 decades, through her husband's death and her own long widowhood, through the passing of almost everyone who had lived through the crisis at all, she kept the coldness perfectly intact, a permanent frost that no season ever thawed. It asked nothing dramatic of her, no scenes, no public denunciations, only a steady, lifelong withholding, a door kept shut for 60 years. And that, perhaps, is the more chilling kind of vengeance, not the fire, but the ice, not the outburst, but the endless, patient, smiling refusal to relent, maintained by a woman the whole world believed incapable of an unkind thought. The grudge also reveals how selective her famous warmth actually was, and how firmly it was governed by loyalty. She could be endlessly, genuinely kind to a gardener, a soldier, a stranger in a crowd, to anyone who posed no threat to the family or its position, but cross the line that mattered to her, betray the institution, or damage the people she had chosen to protect. And the warmth vanished as though it had never been, replaced by a coldness that no appeal could thaw. Edward had betrayed the crown, and, as she saw it, killed her husband by doing so. Wallis was the cause, and so the two of them were placed forever on the far side of that line, outside the reach of her kindness, for the rest of her days. The charm was real, but it was not unconditional, and the condition was absolute loyalty to the thing she served. Those who kept faith were loved without limit. Those who broke it were exiled without mercy, and never let back in. Her reasons, as she herself understood and privately held them, ran directly back to her husband and to what the abdication had cost him. She held Edward personally responsible for the crisis that had thrown the crown so violently onto George VI. She believed with total conviction that the ceaseless strain of the kingship, the strain of a role her husband had never been raised or prepared to carry, had steadily worn him down and shortened his life, and that Edward and the woman he had abandoned the throne to marry were therefore, in the deepest possible sense, the joint authors of her husband's early death at the age of just 56. That is a very heavy charge for one person to lay against another, and she laid it fully, and having once laid it, she never afterward lifted so much as an ounce of it. The froideur toward Wallis, the name that went unspoken across decades, the royal style so pointedly denied, all of it flowed directly and unstoppably from that single fixed and unshakable belief about who had truly broken the gentleman she had married. Her biographer, Ingrid Seward, wrote that the Queen's attitude toward the Windsors bordered on a vendetta, and the word has stuck fast to the story ever since. because it fits the whole long pattern of the conduct so closely. But the honest account is bound to hold up the other side of it too, because the true inner nature of the grudge was in fact disputed by people who had known her well and at close quarters. The Duke of Grafton, who was close to her for many years, said quite flatly that she never once said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor. So there remains a real and open question, which this story deliberately leaves open rather than pretending to resolve, about whether what ran beneath that famous surface was a hot and active vendetta of the kind Seward's word suggests, or instead simply an enduring, immovable, glacial disapproval, expressed through perfect and unbroken coldness rather than through any spoken venom at all. The outward behaviour is documented beyond any dispute. The true temperature of the heart behind it is not documented at all, and anyone who claims to know for certain exactly what she felt across those 60 years is guessing at it. What is entirely certain is the sheer reach of the thing across time. The grudge did not stay safely locked away in the 1930s where it was born. It shaped her attitudes and her judgments for the rest of the whole century, and it reached forward, decades later, to touch the next great crisis to strike the family. When a young woman named Diana entered the royal family many years afterward, and that glittering marriage began slowly and publicly to fracture and fail, the Queen Mother is reported to have seen in the unfolding situation a direct echo of the old original wound, and to have regarded Diana, at certain moments, as another Mrs. Simpson, another dangerous outsider woman, around whom the whole monarchy might once again begin to tear itself apart. Whether that reading was in any way fair to Diana is a separate question entirely, and not one for this chapter. What it shows, beyond any argument, is how astonishingly deep the groove of 1936 had been cut into her. That fully half a century further on, she was still instinctively reading brand new people and brand new crises through the fixed and bitter template of the brother-in-law, who had, as she saw it and never stopped seeing it, killed her husband simply by walking away from his duty. Here, then, was the vengeful woman that the title names, laid out plainly in the record of her own sustained conduct. And here also is the exact thing that makes her so genuinely hard to hold within any single frame. This is the very same person who charmed an entire nation, who steadied a blitzed and burning city, who inspired 50 unbroken years of uncalculating love in the servants who knew her most closely of all. The warmth was completely real, and the grudge was every bit as real, and it was utterly implacable, and it lasted for 60 years without a single day's remission. The woman waving in pastel from the balcony, and the woman who would not, across 6 decades, allow Wallis Simpson's name to be spoken in her presence, were one and the same woman, indivisible, and the adoring country was only ever shown the first of them. Chapter 10. The Governess Who Told the Truth. The woman who had raised her 2 daughters wrote one warm little book about their childhoods, and for that single act she was cut dead by the entire family until the day she died, alone, nearly 40 years later. Her name was Marion Crawford, and to the 2 young princesses she had cared for, she was, all through their childhoods, simply Crawfy. She came to the household in 1933 as governess to the young Elizabeth and the younger Margaret, and she stayed on in that role for 16 full years until 1949, giving over the whole of the best part of her adult life to the raising of another woman's children. She delayed her own marriage year after year after year, holding it off well into her middle age in order to remain in royal service, and she finally married a man named George Boothleigh only late in 1947, after many years of delay, shortly before her royal service came to its end. She had been, by every measure that could be applied, the most devoted of all possible servants, present for the daily ordinary life of the two girls in a way that their busy and grand royal parents very often simply were not. When at last she retired, she was rewarded in the customary manner of a long-serving and much-valued royal servant. She was given Nottingham Cottage, a grace and favour house within the grounds of Kensington Palace, to live in rent-free for the rest of her days, and Queen Mary herself, the old queen, is said to have personally furnished it for her with antique pieces and prints as a warm mark of the family's appreciation for all her years of service. She received a pension. She received a royal honour. She had served long and faithfully. She had been thanked and provided for, and she might very easily have lived out a quiet and comfortable and honoured old age, wrapped in the lasting warmth of the family's gratitude. Instead, she made the one single mistake that the closed world she had served could never under any circumstances forgive. In 1950, she published, first in the magazines Woman's Own in Britain and the Ladies' Home Journal over in America, and then shortly afterward as a full book titled The Little Princesses, an affectionate insider's account of the two royal childhoods she had spent 16 years overseeing. The book was, by any calm and reasonable standard anyone might apply to it, entirely harmless. It was affectionate, gentle, admiring, discreet, a fond insider's portrait of two happy royal children growing up in a loving family. One reviewer would later call it a book of such sugary confection that it seemed almost incredible that anyone at all could possibly have taken offence at it. But harmless as it was in its actual content, it broke a rule that within that particular household was nothing less than absolute, the great unwritten rule of total silence. The people who lived and worked around the royal family did not write about the royal family. They did not tell tales, however kind and however gentle, out of school. They stayed, in the exact phrase that the Queen herself used in this very matter, utterly oyster. Before the book ever appeared, in the spring of 1949, the Queen had written directly to Crawford, warning her in plain terms that people who held positions of confidence with the family simply must be utterly oyster and must never write and sign articles about the children in their care. The warning was either ignored or else overtaken by contracts already signed and commitments already made. And when the finished manuscript at last arrived, the Queen's private verdict upon it was cold, dismissive, and final. The governess, she said, had gone off her head. What then followed was not an anger that flared hot and slowly cooled over time. It was a complete and total excommunication, and it lasted without the smallest remission for the entire remainder of Marion Crawford's natural life. She was cut off, absolutely and permanently. No member of the royal family, not one, ever spoke to her again as long as she lived. In due course, she lost the Grace and Favour cottage as well, the rent-free home within the palace walls quietly withdrawn. Her very name became, all through the world of royal and aristocratic service, a permanent byword for the ultimate betrayal, so that ever afterward a servant who cashed in on royal secrets, who sold what they had seen behind the door, was said, with a knowing shake of the head, to be doing a Crawfy. The punishment was so total and so lasting, precisely because it was meant to be seen. Marion Crawford was not simply dropped in private. She was made an example of, held up before every other servant and confidant in the royal world as a living warning of what happened to anyone who told, however gently, whatever the provocation. The message could not have been plainer. Serve the family with total devotion for 16 years, and it will thank you and pension you. Break the silence once, by so much as a single kind and admiring book, and every door will close at once and forever, and you will be erased so completely that even in death, not one wreath will come. It was a lesson in the absolute price of disloyalty, taught through one woman's ruin, and it was taught by the very person the country believed to be the gentlest soul in the land. For decades afterward, it worked exactly as intended. The household stayed silent, the secrets stayed sealed, and the memory of what had been done to Crawford sat behind that silence as its guarantee. She had given 16 years of her life to those two children, and for one gentle and admiring little book, she was erased from the family she had served as thoroughly and as finally as if she had committed some monstrous and unforgivable crime against it. What makes the story so hard to square is the sheer disproportion of it. Set the offence against the punishment, and they do not begin to match. The offence was a fond, discreet, admiring book that revealed nothing shameful and betrayed no real secret. The punishment was total exile, the withdrawal of a home, the loss of a family, and a silence that lasted the rest of a life and did not break even at the graveside. A person capable of a proportionate anger might have been hurt, might have cooled toward Crawford, might have kept a wounded distance for a while, and then, in time, softened. There was no softening. The response was calibrated not to the size of the injury, but to the absoluteness of the rule that had been broken, and it was carried out with a completeness that tells you something true and cold about the woman behind the gentle public face. The end of her life is very nearly unbearable to set down in plain words. She retired at last to Aberdeen, in the north of Scotland, and she chose, of all the places in the whole of the country that she might have gone to live, a house that happened to stand close beside the very road that the royal family took each year on their way north to Balmoral. And so, year after year after year, the royal cars would sweep past her door, carrying the family and carrying the grown children she had once raised and loved as her own. And year after year after year, they did not stop and did not slow, and she stood and watched them go by. After her husband died, she sank into a deep depression. She attempted to take her own life, and she left behind a note whose few plain words hold within them the entire weight of her tragedy, that the world had passed her by, and that she could not any longer bear those whom she loved to pass her by upon the road. She died in 1988. When at last she was buried, neither the Queen, nor the Queen Mother, nor Princess Margaret sent so much as a single wreath to her funeral. This is the very sharpest single instance of the whole pattern that this video traces from end to end. A devoted servant of 16 years committed one act that the family privately judged to be a betrayal, and the response to it was total and permanent and entirely merciless, and it came from a woman whom the whole country worshipped, without a shadow of a doubt, as the very living soul of gentleness and kindness. The charm and the coldness were the same woman, the identical person, indivisible. Marion Crawford learned that terrible truth in the cruelest possible way there is, standing at a window in the far north and watching the children she had loved and raised being driven past her door, year upon year upon year, and never once in all that time told to stop. Chapter 11. 50 years in black and pastel. Her husband died at 56, and out of a widow's entirely real and private grief, she constructed a public performance that lasted an unbroken half a century. King George VI died on the 6th of February 1952, worn down at the last by the strain of a reign he had never been raised to expect and had never wanted. Exactly as she had feared, he would be worn down from the very day the crown was forced upon him. She was 51 years old at the time of his death. By the ordinary arithmetic of grief and of age, she might reasonably have expected a decade, or perhaps two, of quiet widowhood still ahead of her. In actual fact, she had 50 years. 5 full decades of continued life after the death of her husband, and what she chose to do with those 50 years stands as one of the most remarkable sustained acts of deliberate self-presentation in the entire history of the modern monarchy. The very first thing that his death produced, on a practical level, was a problem of names. Her daughter was now Queen Elizabeth II, the sovereign in her own right. She herself had been Queen Elizabeth as consort throughout the reign just ended. To have 2 Queen Elizabeths living at once would confuse and muddle the entire country, and so a new style was quickly created for her, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a title that had barely existed in any real form before her, and that she proceeded to make entirely and unmistakably her own. The name itself soon became something very like a brand, warm and grandmotherly, and instantly recognizable to every single person in the land. And beneath the shelter of it, she quietly reinvented herself, from the widowed consort of a dead and half-forgotten king into a beloved national institution standing squarely in her own right, a permanent fixture of the country's life, who would go on to outlast prime ministers and fashions and wars and the better part of the whole 20th century. The grief itself was completely genuine, and one of its very first expressions took the form of a strange and rather moving act of restoration. In the raw early months of her widowhood, on a visit to the far and windswept north of Scotland, she came quite by chance upon a near-derelict and half-abandoned castle standing on the wild and remote Caithness coast, the Castle of Mey, and she bought it, on something close to an impulse of grief, and set about the long, slow work of restoring it. It became, over the years that followed, her one truly private retreat, the single place in all her grand life that was purely and entirely her own, and she kept faithfully to a fixed ritual with it for the rest of her days, using it for about 3 weeks each and every August, and for a further 10 days each October, year after year after year, without fail. The image of a grieving royal widow rescuing and slowly restoring a ruined castle on a wild northern shore is the kind of detail that might have been lifted straight from one of the very period dramas her admirers so loved to watch. And it was entirely and completely real. It was also, like so much else that she did across her long life, both a genuine private comfort to her and, at the very same time, a piece of her growing public legend, a story the whole country took gratefully to its heart. The reinvention that followed the death of her husband was, in its quiet way, one of the most complete acts of self-renewal in modern public life. A widowed consort might reasonably have faded, slipping into a dignified and half-forgotten retirement while the new reign got on with itself. She did the opposite. She built, out of the raw material of her own grief and her own long-practiced charm, an entirely new public character, one that did not depend on a husband or a throne, but stood securely on nothing but the nation's affection for her. The pastel and the feathers and the hats grew, over the years, into a kind of uniform, instantly known, endlessly photographed, a visual promise of continuity and warmth that never changed as everything around it did. She became a fixed point, the one member of the family that no scandal ever touched and no criticism ever reached. And she held that position with such complete success that by the end she seemed less a person who could be judged than a national institution to be simply loved. It was the performance of the Blitz, extended and perfected across half a century of peace. The Castle of Mey deserves a moment of its own, because it shows the woman at her most sympathetic and her most calculated at once, which is to say her most complete. She found it a ruin, a cold and roofless shell on the bleakest edge of the country, and she poured her grief and her money into bringing it back to life. It became the one place that was truly hers, unshared with the institution, a refuge at the very end of the land where she could be, for a few weeks each year, something closer to a private person. That was real, and it was moving. And it was also, at the very same time, a perfect addition to the legend. The grieving widow rescuing a lost castle by the northern sea. A story so exactly suited to the public's love of her that it might have been designed for the purpose. With her, the private truth and the public story were never in competition. They were the same act, and May was its finest single expression. The remaking of herself as the Queen Mother worked so well in the end because it asked nothing of the public that the public did not already want to give. The country, emerging from the war and then moving through the long grey decades of its own decline, wanted a figure of continuity, a warm and unchanging presence that could stand for everything it feared it was losing. She gave it exactly that, and she gave it willingly, growing into the role of national grandmother as though she had been made for it. The pastel and the smile became a kind of promise that some things, at least, would not change, that the old warmth and the old grandeur were still there, embodied in one small, ageless woman. It was a role of enormous public value, and she filled it with total commitment for 50 years. That the same woman was, in private, running an overdraft and nursing a 60-year grudge did nothing to weaken the performance, because the two halves of her never once met in public. Across the 50 long years of her widowhood, she steadily perfected the great role that the war had first created for her. She was the nation's grandmother, the small, ever-smiling figure in pastel and feathers and matching hats, the warm and reassuring still point at the centre of every royal wedding and every royal funeral and every jubilee. The grand old lady who had somehow seen the whole of the century pass and who carried the living memory of it in her own person. She undertook full public engagements right into extreme old age, well past the point where anyone would have thought to ask it of her. She kept up the walkabouts, the ribbon cuttings, the ship launchings, the racing, the endless charm offensive that never for one single day came to a stop. And the country responded to all of it with an affection that only deepened and warmed further as she aged, until in the end she was very nearly less a living person than a treasured national possession, a warm and breathing link to the Blitz and to a whole vanished Britain, loved and cherished quite beyond the reach of any criticism. But underneath the great and seamless public performance, the private woman went on, unchanged, exactly as she had always been. The grudges held firm. The name of Wallis Simpson still went entirely unspoken. The careful private memory of every slight and every injury stayed neatly filed away, forgotten by no one. And the spending, freed now even of the small restraint that a living husband might once have offered, ran on and on and on across the 4 residences and the great racing stable and the couture wardrobe and the ceaseless grand entertaining, a broad and steady river of money flowing outward year after year with absolutely nothing anywhere to dam it or to check it. The widowhood that the adoring country saw was all warmth and dignity and gracious pastel. The widowhood that the private accounts silently recorded was something else, again entirely. A full half-century of expenditure that no state allowance ever came within sight of matching, sustained without a word by her daughter and by the private bank of kings, mounting quietly and steadily all the while toward a reckoning that the loving public would never once be permitted to see. The two things ran in perfect parallel across those 50 years, the public warmth and the private excess, and neither ever touched or troubled the other. On the surface, there was the endless, gracious procession of a beloved public life, the openings and the walkabouts and the racing and the birthdays marked by the whole nation. Underneath it, there was the steady outward flow of money that no allowance matched, the 4 residences kept up, the stable maintained, the wardrobe renewed, the entertaining that never stopped. The country watched the surface and adored it. The bank watched the account beneath it and quietly extended the credit. and the woman who lived at the meeting point of the two simply carried on, warm above and unpaid below, for as long as the arrangement could possibly last, which turned out to be the whole of her very long life. Chapter 12. £4 million in the red. By the end of the 1990s, the private bank that had served the royal family for generations held, standing in the name of the single most beloved woman in the entire country, a number that would have instantly destroyed almost anyone else alive. Her overdraft at Coutts, the private bank of the royal family, was reported to stand at somewhere around £4 million. That figure was the accumulated shortfall of an entire lifetime lived without ever once counting the cost, the total sum of the yawning gap between what she was given by the state and what she actually chose to spend, grown quietly over decades into a private debt on a scale that no ordinary account holder in the land could ever conceivably have run up, for the simple reason that no ordinary bank on earth would ever for one moment have allowed them to. Set the reported figure directly against the income, and the sheer impossibility of it becomes immediately plain. Her public allowance, drawn through the civil list, was about £643,000 a year. The real cost of running her full household was between £1 and £2 million every year, and the overdraft, by the late 1990s, stood at some £4 million. In other words, she had quietly accumulated a private debt equal to very roughly 6 times her entire annual allowance from the state, held at a bank that had gone on calmly extending her more and more credit for one reason alone, a reason that had nothing to do with whether the sums made any financial sense and everything to do with exactly who she was. An ordinary customer of any bank who found themselves £4 million overdrawn does not remain a customer for very long at all. They are called in, cut off, pursued through the courts, and ruined. She was none of these things, and never came remotely close to being any of them, because the borrower in this particular case was the mother of the reigning queen, and the debt was, in the settled and comfortable eyes of the bank, underwritten in full by the wealthiest family in the entire land. Set that £4 million beside the ordinary lives being lived around her at the time, and the strangeness of it comes fully into view. In the late 1990s, when her overdraft stood at some £4 million, the average house in Britain cost a small fraction of that, and an ordinary working family might hope to earn, across an entire lifetime of labour, a sum smaller than the debt she carried without a second thought at a single bank. Her yearly allowance alone, the £643,000 voted to her by Parliament, was more than most people in the country would see in 20 ordinary lifetimes of work. And that great public sum was merely the floor of her spending, not its limit. There was no wickedness in it exactly, no scheme and no fraud. There was only a woman who had never in 100 years been made to feel that money was real, spending as she breathed, while a system built to protect the dignity of the crown quietly ensured that the bill was always, somehow, met by someone else. And this is where the two words of the title finally fuse into one truth: vain and millions in debt. The vanity and the debt were never separate faults that happened to sit in the same person. They were the same fault, seen from two angles: the wardrobe and the flowers, and the 4 staffed houses and the stable of horses were the vanity made visible, the outward show of a woman who needed always to be magnificent, to be adored, to be the warm, bright centre of every room. And the overdraft was simply the price of that show, the bill for the magnificence, run up year after year, because the show could never be allowed to stop or shrink. She could not have been the beloved figure she was on a budget. The immunity that the charm bought her was expensive to maintain, and she maintained it, and the £4 million was what it cost. And the country, had it ever been shown the figure, would very likely have forgiven her even that. This is the final strange power of what she had built. By the end of her life, she had accumulated such a vast reserve of public affection that almost nothing could have spent it down. A lesser figure caught £4 million in debt on the public purse would have faced outrage, headlines, questions in Parliament. She would very probably have faced a fond shake of the head and a joke about the dear old girl and her horses. The love was so deep and so settled that it had become, in effect, unconditional, proof against any revelation, and she knew it, and those around her knew it. And it was on the strength of exactly that unconditional love that the whole comfortable arrangement of her finances rested, safe and unexamined, to the very end. This is the exact point at which the whole shape of her long life finally comes clear, and the two halves of the title, the vanity on the one side and the debt on the other, lock firmly and permanently together into one thing. The £4 million was never the result of some sudden late folly, or of one single disastrous and uncharacteristic year. It was, from first to last, the plain arithmetic of her character, made visible at last in hard figures. It was precisely and exactly what happens when a woman raised from birth to believe that the whole grubby machinery of cost was forever somebody else's concern is then placed, for the following 60 uninterrupted years, in a unique and gilded position where absolutely nobody ever once forces that machinery to become her concern. The haziest notion of what things truly cost, carried unbroken and unexamined all the way from a nursery at Glamis into a widowhood at Clarence House, had a price attached to it after all, and the price was finally written down in cold black figures on the private statements of a private bank, £4 million of it, deep into the red. And still, even now, there was no reckoning. That, in the end, is the single thing that separates her from every other debtor in the whole country. The debt grew, and nothing whatever happened. There was no crisis. There was no public scandal. There was no forced and humbling economy. No quiet selling off of horses or houses. No dreaded meeting with a bank manager who had finally and completely run out of patience. The money simply went on being found, as it always had been, out of the privy purse, out of fresh borrowing, out of the deep and apparently bottomless underwriting of the Crown itself. And the woman at the very centre of it all went serenely on, charming the adoring nation from the balcony, opening its buildings and patting its racehorses, and keeping her 4 great residences and her 12 horses in training, and her vast couture wardrobe entirely and completely undisturbed by the enormous number quietly growing against her name at the bank. This was the ledger no camera ever saw, made suddenly and shockingly real. £4 full million of it, held quietly and permanently in her name, while the country adored her without the very faintest idea on earth that any such thing could possibly exist. There is a single hard question that the whole of this story has been steadily building toward from its very first minute, and the overdraft, once seen, forces that question at last fully into the open. How on earth was any of this allowed to happen? How does a private citizen, even a royal one, even a beloved one, quietly run £4 million into debt against a fixed state allowance and face not one single consequence for it, ever, of any kind at all? And the answer to that question is the one thread that finally ties the whole of her long life together into a single knot. She was allowed to, because she was loved. And she was loved, in very large part, precisely because she had spent an entire lifetime with total discipline and consummate skill, making herself utterly and completely impossible not to love. And that vast reservoir of national love, carefully filled across 65 years, brought her an immunity so total and so complete that it covered not merely the grudges and not merely the lateness and the drink, but the money too, the whole enormous unpaid weight of it. The charm, in the end, was the collateral against which everything else was borrowed. For as long as the country adored her, no one on earth would ever call in the debt. And the country would go on adoring her, faithfully, for exactly as long as it was never once shown the bill. She was in her late 90s now, the last great surviving figure of a wholly vanished age. The reckoning that had never once come to her in all her long life was, in a sense, still quietly waiting for her, held off now only by the single event that even she, with all her charm and all her armour, could not talk her way past or charm away. And when that one event finally came, the great debt would at last be settled in the very same way that every single thing in her long life had always been settled, quietly, by the family, entirely out of sight, so that the ledger closed at the last without the loving public it so nearly concerned ever once learning that it had, for so very long, been open. Chapter 13. The money moved out of reach. 8 years before she died, most of her personal fortune quietly slipped out of her own name and passed into trust for the children of her grandchildren. It is a detail that badly complicates the easy picture of a purely reckless spender, and it belongs squarely in any honest account of her, because it shows a woman, or at the very least a careful household arranged around a woman, entirely capable of shrewd and far-sighted planning whenever the stakes were high enough to demand it. Her personal wealth was estimated at somewhere around £19 million. Roughly 2/3 of that whole sum was quietly moved, some 8 years ahead of her death, into a series of trusts established for her great-grandchildren, an arrangement that at one stroke both provided handsomely for the coming generations of the family and sharply reduced the tax that would one day fall due upon her estate. The contrast between that careful arrangement and the £4 million overdraft is sharp, and it is deeply instructive about how her whole world actually worked. Here was the very same woman who ran millions of pounds into the red at her own bank, whose household never counted a single penny, and whose notion of the true cost of things was reliably the haziest in the entire kingdom. And yet her affairs were arranged, in this one absolutely crucial respect, with real and effective foresight. The explanation for that apparent contradiction is simple, and it is the key to the whole thing. She did not suddenly discover thrift and financial prudence somewhere in her late 80s. The whole grubby machinery of cost, kept carefully invisible to her across the entire span of her life, was simply worked, once again, on her behalf and over her head, by other people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. The identical hidden apparatus that had quietly paid her bills and covered her spreading overdraft since she was a child now arranged her estate for her, smoothly moving the great bulk of the family money safely out of the reach of the taxman well before the end could come. The timing of it tells its own quiet story. To move money into trust and have it fall safely outside a death duty, the transfer generally has to be made a certain number of years before the death, so that it cannot be treated as a deathbed dodge. That the bulk of her fortune was moved some 8 years ahead of her death, when she was already past 90, shows a cool and deliberate calculation running underneath the grandmotherly image, a clear-eyed reckoning with her own mortality and with the taxman waiting beyond it. The woman who could not, or would not, grasp the cost of a wardrobe or a stable understood perfectly well, or was made to understand by those around her, exactly how to shield tens of millions of pounds from the state. The vagueness about money, in other words, was selective. It applied to spending, where vagueness was a pleasure and cost her nothing, and it vanished entirely when it came to protecting the family's wealth for the generations to come. This is the detail that should make anyone pause before accepting the fond image of a dear old lady who simply never understood money. She understood it perfectly well when it mattered to her. The great fortune was arranged, protected, and passed on with cool precision, timed to the year to escape the taxman, shepherded safely to the great-grandchildren while she still lived. What she declined to understand was the far smaller matter of her own daily spending, and she declined to understand it because there was pleasure in the not understanding and no cost to her in it whatever. The overdraft grew because it was allowed to grow, and it was allowed to grow because it never threatened anything that actually mattered. The wealth beneath it was safe, locked away by clever hands, and the debt on the surface was, in the end, a rounding error against a fortune already secured. The trusts also quietly answer a question that hangs over the whole story, which is whether she was truly careless with money or merely careless with the kinds of money that did not matter to her. A genuinely reckless person does not shield the bulk of a fortune from tax with 8 years to spare. The care was there all along, exercised on her behalf where it counted, on the capital, the estate, the inheritance of the family. What was absent was any care at all about her own daily outgoings, and the absence was not an incapacity, but a permission. She had been given, from birth and then again by her position, a lifelong pass from ever having to think about the cost of her own comfort, and she used that pass to the very fullest. The money that would pass to her heirs was guarded like treasure. The money she spent on herself was treated like air. Both, in their way, were perfectly rational choices for a woman in her unique position, and together they explain the strange double picture of a spendthrift whose fortune was, at the end, entirely secure. There is a small irony in all of this. The generation the money was moved to protect were her great-grandchildren, the children of a family she had served, guarded, and shaped for the whole of her adult life. Whatever else may be said of the spending and the grudges, the instinct to provide for the family, to keep its wealth intact and passing safely down the line, ran as deep in her as anything did. She had come into the royal family as an outsider, a Scottish earl's daughter marrying above her station, and she left it, having made herself its warm centre and having quietly secured its fortune for the generations she would never live to see. The dynasty she had married into at 22, she served in her own way, right to the end, moving the money out of the taxman's reach with the same care she had once given to steadying a frightened king. This is a matter of scale, and the scale is stark once it is set out clearly. A personal fortune of about £19 million, roughly 2/3 of it, some £12 or £13 million, placed carefully into trust for the great-grandchildren years in advance of her death. An overdraft of around £4 million standing all the while against her at the bank. And an estate that would still, even after those large trusts had been carved away from it, be valued in the tens of millions of pounds. These are simply not the numbers of a woman ruined and undone by her own extravagance. They are, on the contrary, the numbers of a woman whose extravagance was indeed total and lifelong, but whose underlying wealth was so very deep and so extremely well managed on her behalf by professionals that even £4 million of accumulated personal debt amounted to little more than a single manageable line in a far larger and far healthier account. And that, in the end, tells you something final and something important about the whole world she moved through. For an ordinary person, spending is a hard and unforgiving zero-sum business. What goes out does not come back again, and debt is a real and constant threat to survival itself. For the Queen Mother, spending and wealth and debt all existed together inside a family fortune so vast and so carefully and expertly tended around the clock by others that her own personal habits, however wildly lavish they became, never once actually endangered anything at all. She could run an overdraft that would have bankrupted a duke outright, and at the very same time, her deeper fortune could be quietly and expertly shepherded into protective trusts to keep it safe and whole for the generations still to come. The spending was real. The grudges were real. And underneath both of them, all the while, the hidden machinery hummed steadily on, keeping the entire vast edifice safe and standing, so that the small, smiling woman on the balcony never once, in 101 years, had to know what anything cost or fear what anything she did might do to her. She was very old now, well past 100 years of age, the last great figure of a wholly vanished world. The great performance had run, without a single serious stumble, for the better part of an entire century. And now, at long last, it was drawing quietly toward its close. Chapter 14. The last of the long life. She outlived very nearly everyone she had ever known, and at the very last she buried her own younger daughter before she herself was gone. Princess Margaret, her second child, died in February of 2002, and the old Queen Mother, by then frail and grieving and well past 100 years old, was forced to endure the one thing that no parent is ever meant to endure, the death of a child, in the final weeks of her own long life. It was just 7 weeks after Margaret's death that her own came at last. On the 30th of March, 2002, at 3:15 in the afternoon, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died peacefully in her sleep at Royal Lodge in Windsor, with her elder daughter, the Queen, there at her bedside. She was 101 years old, and she had lived across 3 centuries and very nearly the whole span of the modern age. The sheer length of the life needs holding in the mind for a moment, because it explains a great part of the feeling that surrounded her end. She had been born while Queen Victoria still sat on the throne, and the country still ruled a great empire. She had lived through the sinking of great liners, 2 world wars, the loss of the empire, the coming of the motor car and the aeroplane, and the television and the telephone that fit in a pocket. She had known, personally, prime ministers whose careers were history before most of the mourners in the queue were born. To the country that gathered to grieve her, she was not merely a beloved old lady. She was the last living thread back to a vanished Britain, the final witness to a whole world that had passed, and burying her felt, to millions, like closing the door at last on the century she had crossed. That feeling, more than any policy or any duty, was what brought the vast crowds into the cold streets, and it was the ultimate dividend of a lifetime spent making herself beloved. And the crowds saw exactly what they had always been shown, which was the smile, and nothing behind it. 200,000 people did not queue along the Thames to mourn a woman who had held a grudge for 60 years, or cut a governess dead at a window, or run £4 million into the red at her bank. They queued to mourn the grandmother of the nation, the brave, small figure of the Blitz, the last warm link to a vanished age. That was the woman the country had been given, and that was the woman it grieved, wholly and sincerely, in the cold spring streets. The other woman, the one this story has slowly uncovered, was not present at the funeral in any way the mourners could see. She had been folded away, as she always had been, behind the version of herself that everyone had agreed to love. It is a strange thing to grieve a person so completely and know so little of them, and yet that is what the whole nation did in the cold April of 2002. The mourners in the mile-long queue brought with them a lifetime of images, the wartime walkabouts, the racing colours, the endless birthdays, the small figure waving from the balcony year after year, and every one of those images was true, and not one of them was the whole of her. She had spent a century curating exactly what the country would see, and the vast, sincere, unquestioning grief that met her death was the final proof that the curation had worked perfectly. The people wept for the woman they had been shown, the woman they had not been shown, the one who had kept the accounts and the grudges, went to her grave with her secrets as sealed as she had always demanded they be kept. Set the scale of the mourning beside the scale of the debt, and the two numbers, placed together, tell the whole story at a glance. 200,000 people in the queue, more than a mile of them along the river, 10 million watching the funeral. And, on the other side of the ledger, £4 million of quiet debt, 60 years of an unbroken grudge, one governess erased for a single book. The first set of numbers is the love, counted in bodies and hours and tears. The second set is the cost, counted in pounds and years and one ruined life. She had spent the whole of her 101 years making sure that the country would only ever see the first column and never the second. And in the vast, grieving crowds of that April, she succeeded completely, one final time. The response of the country to her death was extraordinary, and it stood as the final and most complete proof of everything that the charm had so patiently built across the decades. Here was a woman who had been born in the very last summer of Queen Victoria's long reign, in the age of the horse and the gas lamp, and who had died in the age of the mobile telephone and the aeroplane. A single living bridge stretched clear across the whole of the 20th century. She had been queen consort through the war that defined and forged the modern nation. She had then been the nation's grandmother through 50 long years of public widowhood. And when at last she died, the vast reservoir of affection that had gathered around her across all of those decades poured out of the country in a way that genuinely took even the palace itself by surprise. She lay in state in Westminster Hall, in the ancient heart of the Palace of Westminster, from the 5th of April, and the people came to her. Over the course of 3 days, some 200,000 ordinary mourners filed slowly and quietly past her coffin to pay their last respects to her. The queue of people waiting for their turn to reach her stretched back for more than a mile, along the bank of the River Thames and out across Lambeth Bridge. And it grew so long and so persistent that the authorities were obliged to extend the opening hours again and again to let more of them through. In the raw cold of an early English spring, ordinary men and women stood patiently for many hours in a line more than a mile in length, all for the chance to walk for a few short seconds past the coffin of a woman that almost none of them had ever once met or spoken to. It was a display of raw national feeling on a scale reserved in any age for only the very few, and it was the last and by far the greatest harvest of an entire lifetime spent being loved. Her funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on the 9th of April, 2002, in the same great and ancient church where she had married her shy prince very nearly 80 years before, and where the two of them had together been crowned king and queen. Around 10 million people across the United Kingdom watched the ceremony. It cost, all told, more than £5 million to stage. The small girl from Glamis, who had refused a prince not once but twice, who had been made a queen by another man's abandonment of a throne, who had charmed a whole nation through its very darkest war, and then reigned over its deepest affections for a full half-century as a widow, was carried out of public life at the very end upon a great rising tide of national grief and gratitude, as deep and as genuine as any the modern monarchy has ever known, or is ever likely to know again. And the country that mourned her so completely and so sincerely mourned, right to the very end, only the one half of her that it had ever actually been shown. It grieved the smile and the pastel and the wartime courage and the endless grandmotherly warmth. It knew nothing, or very nearly nothing, of the other half, the 60-year grudge held without mercy, the devoted governess cut stone dead at the window and left to watch the cars go by, the great household that never once counted the cost, the the £4 full million standing quietly against her name at the private bank. The long performance held perfectly, seamlessly, even in death itself. 200,000 people queued in the cold along the Thames for the beloved woman on the balcony, and the private account that had run beneath her the whole of her life went down with her, entirely unread, into the ground. Chapter 15. The Debt That Died With Her. When her affairs were at long last settled, the whole of her estate passed to her daughter without a single penny of tax, and the £4 million overdraft simply vanished into a fortune more than large enough to swallow it whole and never notice. The true size of that estate was never precisely made public, and the palace was carefully at pains to describe every circulating figure as speculative. But the British press of the day estimated it at somewhere between £50 and £70 million, a sum that in dollar terms was put at around $73 million. It held within it works of art by the painter Claude Monet, and treasures by the great jeweller Fabergé, and jewels, and the accumulated contents of her several great houses, the vast gathered accumulation of 101 years of the single most privileged private life in the entire country. The crucial fact about that whole estate is the thing that did not happen to it. It did not surrender the ordinary 40% share to inheritance tax that falls, by law, upon every other large estate in Britain. Under a special arrangement that had been reached quietly with the government back in 1993, bequests passing directly from one sovereign or consort to the next were formally exempted from that tax, on the stated reasoning that the monarchy would otherwise be steadily and deliberately impoverished by death duties compounding across the generations. And so the whole of the Queen Mother's estate, tens of millions of pounds of art and jewels and property together, passed intact and entire to the Queen, completely free of tax, at the very same moment when any ordinary family in the land inheriting even a small fraction as much would have been obliged to hand very nearly half of the whole thing straight over to the state. The contrast there is a hard one, because it is the whole argument of this story compressed into a single transaction. An ordinary widow leaving her children a modest house and a few savings might see the taxman take a hard bite of it. The Queen Mother left tens of millions of pounds in art and jewels and property, and the state took nothing at all by prior arrangement as of right. The same principle that had governed her whole life governed her estate at the end of it. The ordinary rules that discipline ordinary people, the rules of debt and tax and consequence, simply did not apply to her, and had never applied to her, and did not begin to apply to her even in death. She had lived her entire life on the far side of those rules, and she was buried on the far side of them too, her fortune passing whole and untaxed to the daughter who had paid for everything, the debt dissolving quietly into the transfer like a stain washed out of cloth. There is no villain in this to point at, and the story is the stronger for it. The Queen who quietly covered her mother's spending across the decades did so out of love and duty. The bank that extended the credit did so out of prudence and deference. The arrangement that spared the estate its tax was made openly by a government for reasons it thought sound. Every single part of the machine acted, in its own terms, reasonably. And the sum of all that reasonable behaviour was a woman who lived 101 years entirely beyond the reach of the ordinary consequences that shape every other life, spending without limit, forgiving nothing, and adored to the last. The system did not fail. The system worked exactly as it was built to work. That is the uncomfortable part. And so the great reckoning that this whole story seemed to be building toward never actually arrived. There was no reckoning, in life or in death. The debt did not ruin her, because a fortune stood behind it. The grudges did not shame her, because the public never knew of them. The governess she destroyed did not damage her, because the household stayed silent and the press stayed loyal. Every thread that might, in an ordinary life, have gathered into a consequence was quietly absorbed, paid off, or sealed away, and the smiling figure at the centre of it all passed through 101 years without ever once being made to answer for anything. That, in the end, is not a story about money at all. It is a story about what enough love, carefully earned and carefully kept, can buy a person, which turns out to be almost everything, including the right never to be judged. Money, in the end, was the least of what her charm secured for her, though the £4 million is the part that startles. The charm bought her the throne's affection when she had married only its spare. It bought her a nation's forgiveness in advance, for anything, for everything. It bought her the silence of a whole household, the loyalty of a whole press, the devotion of servants who gave her their lives. And it bought her the one thing that neither rank nor wealth alone can ever secure, which is to be loved so completely that no one ever looks past the loving to ask a single hard question. The debt was simply the bill for the show, and the show had bought her a life beyond the reach of consequence. Weighed against that, £4 million was nothing, a trifle, the smallest and easiest of all the prices that were quietly paid by others, so that the woman on the balcony could go on being adored. And along with the estate, there went the debt. It is very widely said, and it follows naturally and logically from the way in which all of these things actually work, that the Queen settled her late mother's overdraft, that she cleared the £4 million that had stood against her at Coutts as a simple part of the orderly settling of the whole estate. Here, though, a careful note of honesty is genuinely owed, because this is the exact point upon which the title turns, and it therefore deserves above all to be got precisely right. What is firmly and solidly documented is the reported overdraft of around £4 million, and the passage of the whole estate to the Queen free of any inheritance tax. That the Queen then personally wrote a cheque to clear the overdraft is the natural inference from those two facts, and it was reported as such at the time, but it is not itself documented to quite the same hard and solid standard as the £4 million figure. What can be said with complete confidence is that the debt and the fortune passed together into the very same hands at the very same moment, and that an overdraft of £4 million set against an estate of 50 to 70 million is very far indeed from any kind of ruin. It is a single line item, quietly and easily absorbed into a wealth many times its size. So the great reckoning that had never once come for her in the whole of her long life did not, in the end, truly come to her in her death either. There was no accounting after all, no exposure, no public moment at which the loving country was finally shown the bill and asked plainly what it thought of it. The debt was instead quietly and smoothly folded into the estate, and the estate itself passed, entirely free of tax, to the very daughter who had faithfully underwritten the whole lifetime of spending all along, and the books were closed upon the entire matter without so much as a single ripple ever reaching the surface of public knowledge. The hidden machinery that had kept the true cost of her life so completely invisible from her cradle onward performed its very last and its very smoothest service of all at her graveside, settling the account discreetly and finally out of sight, so that even in death the famous smile was never once troubled by the sum. It was, in its own quiet way, the perfect ending to the exact life that this whole story has traced from its beginning. Everything that might ever have counted against her, the grudges and the spending and the debt alike, had been kept entirely away from the public across a full 101 years by the twin and tireless forces of a family's bottomless wealth and a nation's boundless love. Death itself changed none of it. The wealth calmly absorbed the debt. The love easily survived the woman. And the whole truth of what she had spent, and of whom exactly she had never once forgiven, stayed precisely where it had always been kept, on the far and hidden side of the smile, sealed away where the loving country would never think to look. Chapter 16. The ledger no camera ever saw. The country buried a beloved grandmother, and in the very act of burying her, it closed the book for good on a woman it had never once quite been allowed to see. That is the plain truth that this long story finally arrives at, and it is not in the end a truth that calls her a fraud, because the warmth in her was never for a single moment fake. The woman who steadied a burning and blitzed city, who inspired 50 full years of uncalculating love in a servant like William Talon, who charmed gardeners and playwrights and presidents with exactly equal and effortless ease, was entirely and completely real. The kindness was real. And so, at the very same time and in the very same person, were the £4 million and the 60-year grudge held without mercy, and the devoted governess cut dead at the window and left to watch the cars sweep past her door. The whole deep difficulty of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the exact thing that makes her so very much harder to hold in the mind than any simple heroine or any simple hypocrite ever could be, is that the whole of it was somehow true all at once, within one small, smiling woman, across the span of one extraordinarily long life. The charm was not a mask laid carefully over the ledger. It was the very same faculty doing both kinds of work at once. The identical gift that warmed a whole frightened nation and armoured her utterly against any possible consequence for how she chose to live. She had learned, as a small girl running free at Glamis, that warmth was power, and that to be truly loved was to be truly safe. And she had then spent the following 90 years proving that childhood lesson correct, over and over again, upon the very largest stage that the world had to offer her. The love that she generated was completely genuine, and it was also, at the very same time, quite simply, the most valuable single thing that she owned, worth far more than all the art and all the jewels and all the great houses put together, because it bought for her the one thing that no amount of mere money ever can, which is a total and lasting immunity. An ordinary woman, £4 million in debt, meets the hard wall of the bank. An ordinary employer, who coldly destroys a devoted servant, meets the judgment of those around them. She met neither of these things, not once. And she met neither of them precisely because she was so completely adored. And she was so completely adored, in no small part, entirely by her own long and careful design. That, in the very end, is what her whole long life quietly reveals about the nature of power at the very top of a hereditary system. It shows, more clearly than any lecture ever could, that sheer likability is itself a form of armour, and a very strong one, that a sufficiently and skillfully beloved figure can carry grudges that an ordinary person could never once afford to carry, and can run up debts that an ordinary person could never possibly hope to survive, and pay no real price at all for either of them, for just so long as the treasured public face is never once allowed to slip. And she never let it slip, not for a single moment. Across 65 long years of unbroken public life, through war and through widowhood, and through the whole slow decline into extreme old age, the smile held, and the pastel held, and the grandmotherly warmth held, and behind all of it, safe in its shadow, the private woman spent and remembered and refused, exactly and entirely as she pleased. To ask whether the warmth was real or the coldness was real is to ask the wrong question, because the honest answer is that both were, fully, at the same time, in the same person, all the way down. She genuinely loved her horses and genuinely never forgave her brother-in-law. She genuinely charmed a wounded soldier and genuinely destroyed a devoted governess. She was genuinely the brave, small figure of the Blitz, and genuinely a woman £4 million in debt who had never once been made to care. A simpler person would have been easier to judge and far less interesting to understand. Her whole fascination, 100 years on, is that she refuses to collapse into either the saint the country worshipped or the monster a cynic might reach for. She was neither, and she was both, and the smile was the door that kept the two of them sealed in the same room, out of the public sight, for the whole of her very long life. Perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said of her, and the hardest. Most people are not permitted to be so fully two things at once. The world sees them, judges them, forces the contradictions in them out into the light, and makes them answer for the gap. She was never made to answer, and so the gap in her simply grew, unchallenged, across 101 years, until the warm public woman and the cold private one had become almost strangers to each other, living the same life from opposite ends. The country knew one of them completely, and the other not at all. And when she died, it buried the one it knew, with all the grief and all the honour a nation can give, and the other went quietly into the ground beside her, unseen, unjudged, and unaccounted for, exactly as she had always meant it to. Hold, at the very last, the two images that this whole story has set carefully side by side. There is the small woman on the balcony, waving in her pastel and her feathers, the nation's own darling, loved far past all reach of criticism. And there is the very same woman, sitting at her writing desk, telling a devoted governess in a private letter that those who held her confidence must forever stay utterly oyster, must never once tell, must carry her secrets sealed within them to the grave. And in the end, the whole adoring country did for her precisely and exactly what she had so coldly demanded of Marion Crawford. It stayed utterly oyster. It looked upon the famous smile, and it asked nothing whatever about the sum. 200,000 people stood and queued in the cold along the Thames to mourn a beloved grandmother, and not one single soul in 1,000 of them had the very faintest idea on earth of the great private account that had just, at that very moment, been so quietly settled and closed. She had wanted it precisely that way, and she got it, and that in the end was the whole story of her entire life. She got the crown that she had never once asked for, and she made herself the most loved figure in the whole of it. She got the endless freedom to spend without ever counting, and the devoted family to quietly cover every last penny of the cost. She got the private right to hold a bitter grudge for 60 unbroken years and still be remembered by a whole nation as the very soul of gentleness and kindness. And she got, at the very last of all, the perfect and total silence that she had always demanded of every single person around her, the smile preserved forever, the accounts sealed and closed, the warmth alone remembered, and the rest of it buried with her. To the world she was, and she remains, the nation's grandmother, the small, smiling woman in pastel upon the balcony. All the rest of her went quietly down into the ground with her, in the ledger no camera ever saw. If this account of the woman behind the smile held you all the way to here, then subscribe, because the whole channel works exactly this way, taking the faces that the official portrait was so carefully arranged to show, and gently turning them round to see what was being kept from view behind them. And tell me where you land on the one real question at the heart of it. Do you think the charm was genuine warmth, or the most successful performance in the whole history of the royal family? I read every answer, and this is one I very much want to hear.